Hello, everyone. My name is Jeanette Netzel, and I'm excited to talk to you about my Week 5 critical thinker, Paulo Friere. This quote is from one of Freire's most well-known works, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire says, "It is the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed to liberate themselves and their oppressors as well." The group that would be labeled as the oppressed would achieve this through gaining critical consciousness, and in the process of reclaiming their own humanity, they end up restoring the humanity of the oppressors at the same time. So before we dive into Freire's contributions, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about his life and the circumstances of Brazil in the 1960s that laid the groundwork for his life's work. So, Paulo Freire was born in 1921, and although there isn't a year correlating to the quote on the right, that is in relation to Paulo Freire's childhood. He was born into a middle-class family, and then due to the Great Depression, he became very familiar with poverty and hunger. Freire would later say that experience was what made him decide to dedicate his life's work towards helping the poor and becoming a person deeply involved in education. So in 1943, he entered law school, and in 1946, he was appointed a director of the Department of Education. And this is significant because in Brazil in the 1940s, you needed to be literate in order to vote. And later on in the 1960s, 1961, he goes back to his alma mater and is appointed a department head of cultural extension, and that is what allowed him to begin his work with adults and teaching them literacy. And initially the government approved of this, but in 1964 the government was overthrown by a military coup, essentially with teaching adults critical literacy. He was labeled a traitor and imprisoned for 70 days, and then later exiled to, well, first Bolivia and then to Chile. And this is important because in 1964, approximately 4 million school-aged children lacked schools, and there were 16 million illiterates of 14 years or older. So when a dictatorship comes to power, they do not want somebody who is educating or has the potential to educate the masses to think critically, because that might mean that your power that you just gained is at risk to being toppled again. So essentially, these events formed a lot of Freire's views about education and what one should do with education, what is the purpose of education, and what education can be used as a tool for. So these experiences also influence Freire's core beliefs. And some of his core beliefs are the fact that the world is and always has been inherently unjust or is like a cruel place, but that doesn't mean that there isn't hope to fix it, because Freire is sort of has a romantic view with his writings. But because of this, there's a dichotomy representing that injustice. And Freire uses the terms oppressor versus the oppressed. You could also switch this out to be something like boss versus employee. But he also believes that education is always political, and that education can be a powerful tool for revolution and for liberation, which ties into the liberation ideology. One thing that's important to note about education being a powerful tool for revolution is that Freire believes that the revolution cannot be brought about with the modes of the old order. So that's sort of referencing the banking system of education, which we will later discuss. Freire's core beliefs influence how he views the purpose of education, because there is a dichotomy where there is a group of oppressors who are in power and then those who are being oppressed. The purpose of education becomes one where the oppressed can seek their full humanity, where they can reclaim their humanity. And Freire mentions that during this process of reclaiming their humanity, the oppressed should be careful not to become the oppressor. Freire states that this might happen because in the process of creating change, the oppressed will only have the internalized image of what the oppressor has done in the past, and they might unknowingly use that as a frame of reference and as a guideline. This brings us to Freire's contributions, and one question he asked himself during this process was, how can the oppressed, as divided, unauthentic beings, participate in developing the pedagogy for their liberation? First, Freire identified something he coined as the banking system of education. Freire uses this analogy of a bank where the teacher acts as a narrator character who is in charge of depositing information into the student's brain. The student acts as a receptacle, and they are an empty vessel waiting to be filled with all of the information that the teacher says is important. And actually, this mini lecture on Paulo Freire is a great example of something that would be classified as the banking system of education. I am acting as the narrator who deposits information about Paulo Freire, and as the student, you quietly listen to the information being presented. There's no opportunity for a true dialogue among equals. The banking system of education can also be thought of like water filling the vessel. The teacher has a pitcher of water where they fill it into the empty vessel that the student is. And this is a very top-down system where the teacher is at the top or being in a position of power and the student is at the bottom. To the right, you'll see an excerpt of information that highlights this lopsided dichotomy between the teacher and the student. This dichotomy creates several problems. Students never learn to think critically for themselves, and students learn to adapt to the current system. Freire states that the danger of this is that this banking system is ideal for those in power. Alternatively, Freire suggests something called problem-posing education. He states that you're never going to be able to gain true freedom when you only focus on transferring information in a rote way where students just memorize information and then they reproduce it. You need to have acts of cognition. Problem-posing education creates students who have critical consciousness, and it also rejects the idea that education needs to be top-down. In the banking system of education, the dichotomy of teacher and student is not equal. And so problem-posing education tackles this problem through creating students who are critically aware and have critical consciousness. Next, we'll watch a short clip of Paulo Freire explaining the importance of language in power, and then we'll discuss a little bit more about exactly what critical consciousness is.
who says that this accent or that this way of thinking is the cultivate one. If there is one which is cultivated, this is because there is another one which is not. Do you see? It's impossible to think of that without of language without thinking of ideology and the power. I defend the duty of the teachers to teach the cultivated pattern, and I defend the right of the kids or of the adults to learn the dominant pattern. But it is necessary in being a democratic, tolerant teacher. It is necessary to, to explicitly, to make clear to the kids or to the adults that their way of speaking is as beautiful as our way of speaking. Second, that they have the right to speak like this. Third, nevertheless, they need to learn the so-called dominant syntax for different reasons. That is, the more the oppressed, the poor people, get the command on the dominant syntax, the more they can articulate their voices and their speech in the struggle against the injustice.
So, what exactly is this critical consciousness that will help you against the struggle of injustice? According to Freire, critical consciousness represents things and facts as they exist empirically in their causal and circumstantial correlations. Naive consciousness considers itself superior to the facts, in control of the facts, and thus free to understand them as it pleases. In Portuguese, Freire calls this idea conscientização, and literally translating, at least from Google, that means awareness. But to Freire, this awareness means that you are learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against those oppressive elements of reality. To explain this idea in a different way, we have the phrase, right? Thinking outside of the box. And so critical consciousness would be first becoming aware of, well, what is the box? Where do I fit inside of the box? What is my role? And then how can I break out of the box? When a person is able to critically understand their surroundings, Freire says that is when you're going to be able to take critical action and take steps towards changing your situation and gaining true freedom. Freire says that a key way in which one changes from that naive consciousness to critical consciousness is through dialogue. And dialogue being the exchange of words between two people. Freire had a very specific definition of the word. Words are supposed to become praxis, or in other words, some sort of action. To Freire, a true word has to have both action and reflection. And then he goes on to state that the word minus action is verbalism, and that the word minus reflection is activism. And what that means is that when you say something and you have no intention of following up with an action, it becomes idle, to quote him, idle chatter. It means nothing. It is mere verbalism. Freire says that activism is when you take action for action's sake. You don't really think about why you are doing what you are doing. And he says that that negates true praxis and makes dialogue impossible. Solidarity is an important element or an aspect to think about when it comes to dialogue as well. According to Freire, solidarity is when a person who is initially on the side of the oppressor becomes aware of their actions and their position and truly supports the side of the oppressed. And when it comes to dialogue, this means that they are sure that they are speaking with the side of the oppressed and not using their voice to speak for the oppressed. Without solidarity, a proper dialogue between the two groups may not even be possible to occur. Only through equal dialogue and being able to use words to identify the world around you and what your place is in the world, your current position, does Freire say that you'll be able to gain critical consciousness and that will be a means towards true freedom and liberation. I'll conclude my mini lecture today with a quote I found that I really enjoyed, and that is Freire saying, "It is imperative that the teaching profession be treated with dignity so that society can begin to demand that they perform their duties effectively." So this leads to our questions for discussion. The very first question I have for everyone is, do you think that Freire's ideas apply to the 21st century, apply to today? If you do, how? In what ways? Second question is, what are some of Freire's main contributions towards critical theory? All right, I hope everyone enjoyed learning a little bit more in depth about Paulo Freire. I certainly did, and I enjoyed sharing this information with you. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our discussions.